Less than an hour ago, you saw my talk on confidential computing. That is what I currently do. Technical community architect, meaning that I work directly with the open source projects that support confidential computing for the Linux Foundation. But before that, I was heavily involved in the public disclosure and engagements around supply chain, OpenSSF, and I ran the original security slams where we tried to get security best practices all across CNCF.
Thank you so much. And just very briefly about me, so I'm a co-founder at a company. We do strategic advisory and training in cloud and AI security. We're best known for Cloud Security Podcast and AI Cybersecurity Podcast. So if you are a podcast listener, you can check those out. So I think this discussion, really what we're hoping to do is just kind of get into what the current state of open source security is, especially in the last year. What are the changes we've seen, and what are the things we could be looking forward to going forward in the new year. Last year obviously was really interesting for open source. There were some really novel threats and attacks that we saw, much more sophisticated. I think if you were here for the talk before, the speaker did speak a lot about the sophistication of attacks, and if you have been following the open source space, which I'm sure you have been, given you're here, the attacks did get quite sophisticated. So there was a lot of long-term planning. There was a use of, I'm going to say AI, and don't hate me for it. I think you can't really do a talk these days without saying it. But AI is being used to sort of create profiles on GitHub to sort of escalate open source credibility as well. So there was a lot of that. Obviously, we did have the EU regulation as well that came into effect. So there is an effort to sort of put more safety into these things. And also, of course, we have open source AI models, LLM models as well. So the landscape has changed. If you both were to recap 2024 in this landscape, what are the things that stood out for you guys?
I would say two things on my side. As you mentioned, the potentially social engineering of the contributors is a good entry point for the attackers, and we've seen that sometimes it might take a long time actually for them to build that trust and then potentially gain more permissions to push their code and their payloads. That's the first one. The second one would be obviously the rise of Gen AI and the developers using Gen AI tools that would potentially generate more vulnerabilities in the codes. So I'd say, yeah, those couple of trends. Yeah.
Yep, I think something I've been hearing a lot of is that there's going to be far more code than there ever has been, because everyone's experimenting. There's going to be a lot more debt as well. So it'd be really interesting. For you, Sal, what was open source security in 2024?
So I thought it was really interesting because in 2022, we started doing security slams, making sure that large open source projects for the Cloud Native Computing Foundation had all the best practices in place so that we could avoid supply chain attacks at that level. I then moved on from that project. My colleague picked that up, and we did that again in 2023 with even more projects engaged. And then we looked at the statistics from that afterwards, and we noted that even with that massive intervention, we were only just about equaling out the supply chain attacks that were coming in because they are much more pervasive. So we were seeing AI onto human maintainer attacks. And I do think that we need to evolve sort of AI to automation defense.
Perfect. That actually leads really well into the next question that I had. Obviously, there is, as you mentioned, the landscape's really expanding, and one of the ways that people are looking to sort of address this is through automation. What role does automation and tooling play for you? And if you can sort of maybe expand on that in terms of examples and stuff you can see.
Yeah, well, so there's a lot of really basic automation that you can put in place to ensure that there's no leakage in the decision making. I'm specifically speaking to large open source projects at this time. You want to make sure that there's no leakage in the decision making. So some of these things are really easy to set up with GitHub Actions right now. So something like protecting your merges and making sure that there's double verification before code is intaken is a very good way to use automation to ensure that there's a human in a loop at the appropriate time, especially at this time when you are likely to receive largely AI-generated code by someone who did not create it themselves, so they don't explain to you why it should go into place or how it will be maintained moving forward.
I love that. I love the fact that he said it should be at the right point in time as well, because we've been talking about human in the loop, but I think it's so essential to actually have it at the right point in time in the process. And I think identifying where that point is also sometimes can be quite big of a challenge.
I do have one follow-up to that, because I gave a talk a couple of years ago, and this is before XEUtils came out with as a social engineering vector into a major project. I gave a talk called The Gender Bias in Open Source is a Metadata Problem, and We Can Fix It. And I got that on a diversity track because they wouldn't let me give it as a security track talk at the time. But what I was speaking to there is that at the point in time when you look at a PR from your community, you should be removing all of the identifying factors of that. You do not want to see a face, a name, or an email. You can typically assume, because you work with the same contributors that are highly, highly active, who it is. But you want to be evaluating at the basis of the code and its operation itself before you then go to disclose the community member that's engaging. This can prevent the likelihood of having halo effect for contributors that are coming in as social vectors. And it also has a very nice effect of allowing sort of non-traditional community members that do not have a halo effect in code to actively participate without bias.
Thank you so much for that. What about you, Sonia? Where do you think automation and tooling, where does that fit in?
So mine would be for the smaller projects, if you have one or two contributors, because it's also the majority sometimes of the open source projects. Sometimes I might find that it's a bit daunting to implement security. They don't know where to start. As you mentioned on GitHub, they could actually create a basic small CI/CD pipeline going on the marketplace. There's a lot of security tools. They are free for open source and public repos. Maybe sometimes people forget about this option that is free for public repos. So they can start there. They can start small. They can implement, for example, a software composition analysis tool just to check the packages. They can see what kind of feedback they're getting, and then they can implement other tools in the pipeline and then keep growing their CI/CD pipeline. But at least you have that visibility and catch the security vulnerabilities. That's the good start. There's also around, as you mentioned, the permissions and blocking the merge. So having all of those steps, there's a lot of options that you can implement using the GitHub tools. So you have all of that. It's more around, it might take a little bit of effort to set up all of this at first, but when you've set up this, it's also good to capture all of that in documentation. So in your contributing guides, you might have all of those steps. So this is part of your process. This is not something, and plus this is part of your pipeline, part of the stage when you raise a pull request. This will be, you'll see at the bottom of your pull requests, it will be part of one of the steps. So this will be more part of the workflow. And yeah, but as I mentioned, if for the small contributors, just start small, just implement one tool, see how it goes, and then you can grow up on the pipeline. Yeah.
And I mean, we're talking about different elements of securing open source projects, but if you are serious about this, no matter the size of your project, or if you are contributing to a project right now that does not have these in place, just let them know that there's the OpenSSF security badge, and you will have to go through an entire checklist that recommends the best practices based on what type of project that you have. I even recently made the Chaos project, which is mostly documentation, put some of this into place because it still matters there.
Absolutely.
Also, one thing, if they don't know which vendor to pick on the GitHub marketplace, that is fine. I'm not here to recommend any vendors. This would be up to the contributors, maintainers, depending on their stack, but makes sense in their pipeline, the entry points that they have in the integration, different tools they're using. They can try a couple of tools and see what kind of feedback they're getting and what makes more sense in their projects. But at least you have one. They can ditch one of the two tools, but at least just to start on with that. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Those are some really practical things that people can take away and implement as well. So that's really good to hear. Something that kind of goes hand in hand with open source security, has always been supply chain security. I know a lot of the talks today have kind of spoken on that as well. And I think what we want to understand is if we want to ensure the integrity of the software supply chain, but we are also looking at all the open source dependencies. And I know this is not a new conversation, like we've been talking about supply chain for a long time. Has anything changed in that space? How can we ensure that there is still that integrity in the software supply chain when looking at open source?
I would say going back to the tooling. So yeah, it will depend on the tools that you're implementing on this, just to make sure that you do have that visibility. So I mentioned software composition analysis for the packages. So this for the third party. But if we're talking about proprietary code or first party components, that would be implementing a SAS, for example, to scan your codes. If you're containerizing your applications, also have tools around that to catch the security at that level. So it will depend on the project that you're working on and implementing the tools that make sense at that to cover all of these components, and also having automation, obviously. So again, this is a little bit of effort that you have to set up the pipeline at first, and as mentioned, it might be daunting for the maintainer to set that. But having that automated process, not thinking about implementing security every time they're pushing codes, will make it easier for contributors and also to attract people, because in the README file, for example, they can also explain what kind of tools they've implemented. You can use the little tag just to show, for example, you have the tags, let's say for Circle CI, you have the if the build is green or red, so you also have those tags in security. It's good to have on your README file, have those kind of visibility, and yeah, it would give more visibility for the maintainers as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we have to be a lot more careful with SCA because it looks a lot closer in the products that are readily available, that are unpaid. It looks a lot closer to just compliance, checking a box and getting you something that looks like an SBOM. And that is, I think that's extremely misleading. So depending on the language that or the types of languages that are composite to the project, it's going to be more difficult for a scanner to be able to get 1 or 2 or 3 layers deep. Now, to be very clear, this is something that threat actors have always understood. They are always aiming to get 2 or 3 layers deep to find that one project that is not maintained, that you cannot scan. Also, when we're dealing with some of these languages like Java, we were not able to literally find about 34% of oh my God, I want to say XE utils, I'm so wrong. Right? Log4j, God, I haven't had to say that in a year. So we weren't able to find instances of log4j if they were sitting inside of Uber jars in Java, right? So SCA is not going to save you. Right now, it is just going to give you a compliance marker. If you're doing real security over critical projects, you have to be much more sincere in opening everything up and making sure that you're looking. Then I think one thing that's really important is if you can get into these and you can look at the layers down to as far as you can. Sonatype put out a really, really good report. They put out a really good supply chain report every year, but they've got great researchers that are working on sort of categorical representation of vulnerabilities. And we found this new metric that we could use that was great. It was called MTTU, Mean Time to Update. And what this means is that you can look at your first, second, and third layers, if that's what you can get into, and if you're like over like Kubernetes Golang, you should be able to get there. You want to look at how often all of those layers are themselves updating their releases. And you don't even have to look at the like security levels of them to necessarily get that your MTTU, or the shorter your MTTU, the shorter your mean time to response is, which is kind of psychologically interesting because you still have to do patches, but you know exactly where they are likely to be.
I love that. And not that I'm supportive of more acronyms in cybersecurity, but that's a good one because I think it kind of leads, and I know you mentioned SBOM, and that was kind of like a big topic in 2023, and obviously like 2024, everyone was mostly speaking about AI, but SBOM was something that was kind of introduced as something that would help with the software supply chain security side of things. But in the last year, I think the adoption of SBOM has not really kept up with everything else that's happening in software. Some industries have adopted it. I'd be curious to hear either one of your takes. Like, is that still something that's part of the bigger piece? Like, how has SBOM kind of evolved as part of like maintaining the integrity of the software supply chain? I think the update side that you're saying, that's one piece, definitely, like, you know, making sure that you're updating your SBOMs as well. It's not just good enough just to have one. But is there anything that's happened in last year that, you know, the conversation has evolved from where we were?
Yeah, so I think, I mean, SBOMs in themselves are pretty useless. Attested SBOMs are valuable. And a lot of companies do not have attested SBOMs in place, right? Actually being able to look at the origin and give a guarantee that it is untampered. Because right now, again, when I say that it's masquerading as security, but it's just compliance, it's just a checkbox. If you are thinking that security is reading out a final set of ingredients of your release, do you have any idea how easy that makes it for a threat actor to tamper? That is not your source of truth.
No, I do echo on what you said. Yeah, I'd say also that SBOM is great to give it a visibility, but what's the next step after you have that? You'll have a lot of SBOMs compared with the components that you have, but then what's the next step? Well, for the contributors and maintainers, so that would be, that's the main question also.
Yeah. No, absolutely, and I like the analogy that you're saying, that it's a compliance check, and often in security, a lot of the things do end up becoming a compliance check, which is unfortunate, but I think you've given some really good advice over there as well. I think the other thing that we obviously look at when it comes to open source is credentials and APIs and sort of access. How do you handle like sensitive data when it comes to like open source, things like APIs and credentials? Any advice in terms of how we could be doing that better going forward and what the implications are for that?
No.
Moving on to next question.
It's a part that I have not been focusing on recently, and I know that it's had a lot of evolution, so I don't want to give you advice that's 2 or 3 years old. But I will say, I mean, key management, always been an issue, but linters can help with this as well, just putting in an extra automation to make sure that you haven't released anything sensitive by accident. And then number 2, what's the best way to not have a threat vector on the internet? Don't put it on the internet.
Yeah, I would say having also tools that would capture if you've actually pushed any keys or credentials on your within the code. Just also have that visibility. So adding another tool in your pipeline for that visibility. A lot of tools for the maintainers. Yeah, so having that tool, and yeah, as you mentioned, also that putting those into, yeah.
And I guess this is where like a lot of conversation around like secret management has been there as well, as you said, like, you know, definitely more tools for everything until, you know, someone comes and tries to sell you a platform at some point. When you're trying to integrate secure coding practices, so obviously I think, like I know Sonya, you've been kind of touching on this, but I think it'll be nice to sort of dig a bit deeper into that as well. How are we going to have the most effective secure practices in place? Like, are they like maybe top 3 things that people should be looking at when it practices? Because obviously we're all very busy as cybersecurity people. So Sonya, if you want to maybe start on this one.
Sure. So I'm not going to talk about tooling because I've already talked about tooling. I think I'm just going to come back to the documentation, and because we talked a lot about potentially code of conduct for contributing to the repos, but also what would be good is to implement security within the contributing guide. So having this as a step, so clear documentation, and this also could help more junior developers, just to have also that, to keep that in mind. So also having all the process, so if we're talking about like peer review or like code reviews and all of those, the steps to also integrate security within that.
Yeah, make sure that you have a security MD on your projects. So just a couple of years ago, a really high percentage of CNCF projects did not have a security MD file. And what that discloses is who to contact and how in the case of a 0-day event. And sort of to that note, I think as we are shifting very intentionally and very well, the responsibility of security away from individual maintainers becomes incredibly important to be paying attention to the ecosystems that these sit within, right? When I am speaking with maintainers that are mostly incubated in Phenos, I don't have to have the same concerns. They are in a highly regulated space. They already have a lot of these things put into place. When I'm working with projects that are FedRAMP, right, that are actively consumed by the federal government, those have a higher and different standard of security to them as well. I do not have high concern for them. But these projects that have gained a large amount of attention and following in the last 5 years, but do not come from a traditional security consuming base, they do not have the cultural practices to do security by design, which is why we must do security by automation. And security by automation has to be supported, right? All of these automations are mostly available in GitHub and GitLab, meaning that they had to be brought into place and maintained by a company that's willing to volunteer and provide those.
Yeah, I do echo that. So this, we talk about some sort of framework for the contributors and maintainers do have that security using codes. So yeah, again, like having the documentation and having all of those set up in your repo is really important to not forget it. Yeah.
Absolutely. Now we do have a section where we're going to talk about how AI is kind of affecting this landscape as well. I did want to sort of just take a pause and see if there were any questions in the audience as well, because I know once you get into the AI side of things, the conversations can go on for a bit. So are there any audience questions that I can throw to the panel that anyone wants to put their hand up for? Yes?
Thank you. So, after all these years, what's the single thing that you still see that like, oh God, people are still doing this same non-secret thing after all these years?
Probably pushing API keys and credentials in the codes. That's classic, but that's also why I've mentioned to have a tool to actually catch that, because you might forget that you're actually pushing the environment with all of your credentials and API keys on it, and then you try to delete, but then you need to prune all of your repos and start from scratch. We all know the pain on that. So yeah, having a tool in your pipeline is really important to catch that. Yeah.
Yeah, the biggest problem that I see is not providing developer hours to security hardening, and then providing an unknown amount of security hours to patching seems like a massive waste of time for all of us. So do put automation in place and make sure that you are able to catch a 0-day sitting inside of your system when it will statistically occur.
Thank you. Any other questions in the audience? Save me some walking. Thanks. So yeah, the conversation around AI. So obviously, like a lot of cybersecurity is looking at AI as a way to scale a lot of the things that we're able to do. Obviously, the conversation has been that the threat actors are definitely going to be using it to scale. We've seen that in the open source space as well. How do you see? And I know there's lots of tools and startups that are popping up everywhere that can solve things from every angle, but being practitioners, how do you see AI sort of helping in the space of open source security? Where do you see the opportunities?
I would say more at the AI-powered tools that would capture some patterns, that would go out analyzing the code and catching if there's any vulnerable patterns, and having that visibility on that side. That would be one of the
Yeah, use it to look at your logs. Do not use it to create new code at this time. I've been making the argument for years, and particularly to banks when I consult with them, that cybersecurity has shifted to a real-time response. And I very simply have them review the way that they do communication around site reliability engineering events, and that they do the same for cybersecurity. So borderline real-time logging and real-time response, which correctly coordinates your developer hours to being able to handle those.
Perfect, yeah. I know you said don't use to code it, but the reality is, like we all know, there's lots of AI being used. AI tools are becoming really popular, which has resulted in a lot more code being there, a lot more really bad code also being there, because we don't know, like these LLM models are not perfect. What are some of the biggest risks that you're seeing coming out of this? And is there anything we can do? Because we're definitely going to come out at the other end of this in 2-3 years' time, where we're going to be sitting with a lot of these questionable code. I mean, I might not have enough minutes in this panel left to discuss that, but if you had to think of like the top one or two things, what would they be?
So that would be around the potentially the intellectual property that you're and the data that you're actually putting on those LMs to generate codes. That's one. We've seen the example with, this is not open source, but we've seen the example with Samsung pushing some sensitive information in ChatGPT, and yeah, and then this goes back to shadow AI. So this is when you're in a company, if one of your employees is using an AI tool, it's not vetted by IT or InfoSec. But this is more for the organization. But if we're going back to open source, on the Gen AI side, having all of that code generated, again, we're going back to telling, because we know that developers will use Gen AI tools for writing a documentation, README file, code, obviously, so there's a lot of reasons, and that's great. As technologists, I like actually trying all of those different LMs and see the kind of outputs, but also put responsibilities on the shoulder of the developers with the quality of the prompts. So I've run a couple of experiments with creating, for example, dummy applications, but just with using developer lingo. So just create this basic Express application, and by default the code wasn't secure. So then I was challenging the LM, but this is, as a security practitioner, I know that there was some vulnerability in this output. But for example, if you just add a couple of keywords, so create a secure Express application, the output will be completely different. So this is also, as I said, it put more responsibilities on the shoulders of the developers to actually craft better, more secure prompt if they want. And the second one would be to also have tools that capture, because regardless if the code is coming from Stack Overflow, the contributors, or Gen AI tools, it's also important to catch those vulnerabilities.
Yeah, I think there's two issues that are happening right now. Number one, I think as open source matures, we have to put ourselves into the same regulatory mindset that aircraft development did. So to this day, in the United States, I can strap a jet to my back in Class C or Class D airspace and do whatever I want, because they are not going to regulate me, even if I kill myself. Now, you have extremely different, much higher regulatory expectations when you're in Class A airspace. That is probably the airspace that you use to get here. And you have to consider, what are the security concerns based on the consumers of my production environment? And what are the standards of security that I have in place for those? So that sort of maturity level between having a developing open source project and a like Class A airspace consumed project requires a very, very different developer mindset. The second concern that I really have in this space is a little bit broader. I'm seeing extreme maintainer fatigue because they're getting a bunch of nonsense PRs. They're not able to tell which ones are social threat vectors and which ones are just someone with a very low understanding of how to communicate their code's viability. And it means that we are dealing with about a 3 to 5 year period where we do not have junior engineers maturing into senior engineers, maturing into maintainers, because they are not getting the experience of suggesting a code snippet, having a conversation around how it fits into the logic of the code. So even if it gets intaken, they don't have the capacity to be able to maintain those lines of code, putting us into massive technical debt.
Absolutely.
I think also it's, to your point, this is also increasing the attack surface because now we're taking the AI elements in the equation. And this comes at different stage of the supply chain that we have because we can talk about the LM models that could be also tempered. We can talk about extensions in the IDE if you're using Copilot and other those kind of tools. This could be also in the pipeline if you're using AI-powered tools. So you have all of those entry points for attackers that actually increase that attack surface.
Absolutely, like open source, I remember because we kind of did a similar panel last year, and it was always already a very complex environment. You know, we don't have enough maintainers. As you said, there's maintainer fatigue. You know, it was already complex, and now obviously we've got this, as you said, new technology that's kind of ramping things up. There's definitely opportunities from the positive side as well. My next question was going to be around like emerging threats that we're seeing, but I feel like you guys have kind of covered that already. Is there anything else that we haven't spoken about, like in terms of emerging threats that we as a community need to be a bit more aware of or wary of in this space?
Well, I think we've discussed a lot about the AI threats that we've seen in the last couple of years. Obviously, this will also we'll see some of that in this year and beyond. So yeah, I would say in emerging threats, AI based, because we know ChatGPT has mainstream use, but also there's on the other side for attackers, for example, dark GPT that could create ransomware or phishing emails or social engineering techniques. So yeah, being aware of those. Yeah.
Yeah, I also see something that's really interesting, and this is not supply chain specific, but there's been a rise in genuine efforts around privacy, and those sometimes come into conflict with mature security. One of the things that just amazes me is that right now, if you have people building good honeypots, your adversary, the person that is actively trying to attack your system, is GDPR protected. I'm not allowed to store their IP address. I don't think that is the intent of the law.
But that's what ends up happening, I guess. And it's really interesting you touched on that, Cord, and to what you were saying, we've spoken a lot about the AI threats and the AI emerging threats, but then there's a lot of the other things as well. Like there's the geopolitical stuff that's happening. Obviously, we've had the EU Regulation Act that's come into place, and I think while I was kind of looking up the topic, preparing for this, I was looking at the US. They did have an act that was announced last year, but since then we know there's been a lot of changes there as well. So as much as, you know, we're deep within the technology, like open source is like all of cybersecurity, there are other aspects as well, which, you know, we all already have to be aware of as well. I do want to finish this on a positive note. So in terms of like emerging sort of technologies or innovations, things that you're seeing coming up, it could be like, you know, maybe a small project or, you know, some interesting things. Are they things that you're seeing that kind of tells you that this could be something really exciting for open source security? Or this, you know, is something that's going to be really positive for open source security and could potentially change things? Anything that comes to mind?
Well, yeah, I have a shameless plug, but it's only because I joined the consortium because I care. So confidential computing is something that you should really, really be paying attention to, especially if you're one of these companies that is trying to do an AI product. So what are the things that put you at risk? The back end of your product is a large amount of data and a sensitive algorithm. If I want to get in and grab just an algorithm, I don't have to data dump. I spend significantly less time inside of your system. So we are seeing a lot of attacks where it looks like a blip, right? Where cybersecurity, when I say cybersecurity looks like SRE now, that's kind of what I mean, right? Because I'm looking at a millisecond blip, and I don't know that the most valuable lines of code for my company have just been taken. But on a positive side, confidential computing is a extremely different approach to this, where you must attest down to the hardware that it is the entity that you intend to be dealing with on the other side of the network that it is disclosed over only the specific data that you want to have it functioning over, and that it is only the workload identity. So complete workload identity isolation, so that you do not have workload breakouts, so that you do not have adversarial workloads in your system. That is absolutely the cutting edge of handling security as security becomes increasingly around compute.
Perfect.
I think, well, I'll say more around security and awareness. So I'm entirely self-taught, so I tend to spend a lot of time on the websites that actually help on upskilling. And I found that for cybersecurity, there's more and more really good websites that will help developers know more about those techniques. For example, like Try Hack Me, Hack the Box, but also a shout out to OWASP also, who are providing really good guidelines, a good starting point for developers if they don't know where to start. We've talked a lot about AI, so if you're wondering where to start, have a look at the OWASP Top 10 LMs for applications. This will help you actually better understand what is going on in the AI ecosystem. So I'd say there's a good momentum in the education and awareness side.
Absolutely, and I think to tie it all in, like the ecosystem, I think that's really positive. And the fact that there's a conference where we're talking about this for 2 days, I think that's something really positive, because at the end of the day, it is about awareness. It is about, you know, all of us looking at the little things and trying to make sure that we're using everything that we've got, be it practices, tools, AI, to help improve this as much as we can. I don't know how we're doing for time. Just about. Okay, 4 minutes. So we may have just time for 1 or 2 more questions from the audience if anyone has had a triggered thought between then, or just wants to throw, or maybe even an opinion. It doesn't have to be a question. Someone wants to share an opinion. No? All good? Perfect. Well, thank you so much. Hope you had a lovely conference. Thanks for joining.